Hey guys, history lesson 36, America and the Great War. So the Great War was World War I. We call it World War I now because we know now that it was not the only big war in the 20th century. It was the first World War, and we had another World War later, but at the time they called it the Great War, because it really truly was obviously a great war. Let's do a bit of review. American imperialism often led to its perception of being a what? So again, you should have your notebooks opened. This is from yesterday's lesson on imperialism versus isolationism. So American imperialism often led to the perception of America being a bully. The Panama Canal was completed in 1914. It had a major impact on water transportation. The Spanish-American War erupted as a result of tension in Cuba. The Spanish-American War liberated several nations from Spain, and these nations were annexed by the U.S. What nations were they? Cuba, at least partially. The Philippines. And as we talked about, there was a lot of resentment and anger that came out of that because of the way the American people treated the Philippines. And Puerto Rico, which is actually still an American territory. Several territories that were added in the 1800s that were naval outposts. What were they? Midway, Guam, Wake Island, Johnston Islands, and American Samoa. What were the two territories that were added in the mid-1800s that later became states? Alaska and Hawaii. Why was Alaska important? It has a lot of natural resources, and it is a key military outpost. Why is Hawaii important? Because of a very important naval base called Pearl Harbor, and because of things like sugar plantations and tourism and things like that. What is a policy or ideology of extending a country's rule over foreign nations? It's called imperialism. What is the policy or doctrine of isolating one's country from the affairs of other nations? Isolationism. Okay. Let's jump in. So today, history lesson 36, America and the Great War. So America and World War I. We're going to go through this one pretty quickly. We could talk a lot about World War I, but we're gonna try to refrain from doing that because, well, we learn more about it in world history, more of the details. So we're just going to kind of touch on America's involvement in World War I and so forth. So World War I, how did it start? Why did it start? What led to World War I starting? So there's this term called nationalism. Nationalism is identification with one's own nation and support for its interests, especially to the exclusion or detriment of the interests of other nations. Okay, let me go through that again. Nationalism is identification with one's own nation and support for its interests, especially to the exclusion or detriment of the interests of other nations. Okay, make sure you write this down. I want you to write these notes down. I just wrote them ahead of time on the board so we can move through a little bit faster. I do have more notes. These are not the only ones, all right? Anyway, nationalism began to become a big deal in Europe. It began to spread throughout Europe. Throughout history, at first initially you had like warring tribes and stuff that eventually kind of morphed into fiefdom and kind of these small kingdoms with lords and knights and things like that. But eventually that changed into having, more like kingdoms with kings ruling them. And, that eventually led to nations and countries. So those things were kind of still being formed. And nations were still into growing. They were still into imperialism. They still wanted to grow and build empires. So they were very nationalistic in Europe, and they were very imperialistic. They wanted to empire build. All right? So you had all these nations vying for power in Europe. Britain, of course, was a powerful nation. France was a semi-powerful nation. And then Germany comes along. And Germany starts building up its military and its navy. And they start becoming a threat. The Kaiser Wilhelm, he was somebody who wanted to grow Germany's power. So you had all these nations vying for power, and all of them kind of wary of each other, watching each other suspiciously, and afraid that if other nations were coming to power, that it was a threat to their power. So what did they do? They started building alliances. So if you guys have ever played Risk, depending on your rules, maybe you played that you could have alliances, right? So if you're afraid, if you're playing Risk and your brother is still mad at you from the last time you played and he's determined to get rid of you, maybe you'll make an alliance with your sister so that you can beat him, right? Well, that's kind of how it is. Nations make alliances with each other and they say, listen, if this nation attacks you, we will help you. If this nation attacks us, you have to help us, right? So they started building all these alliances, and there's all these nations, who are making treaties with each other and saying things like, if you help us, we'll help you. And then they're all kind of suspicious of these other guys. And it was just turning into a mess. It was just, all these things were going on that made Europe this powder keg for a massive war, right? So one of the countries was a country called Austria-Hungary, and they were in alliance with Germany and with the Ottoman Empire, which is modern-day Turkey. And Austria-Hungary was having some issues with part of their country was called Serbia. It was sort of like a separate area, but it was still under Austria-Hungary. And the Serbians were not very loyal to Austria-Hungary. So, long story, but anyway, Austria-Hungary sent the Archduke Ferdinand, who was in line to become the king. They sent him down to Serbia to kind of do this tour of the country to try to win favor and win loyalty from the Serbians. And most of you probably know he got there, and him and his wife both were assassinated by somebody who wanted to be free from Austria-Hungary. So anyway, that was the spark that lit the powder keg. That eventually led to Austria-Hungary invading Serbia, which led to the Russians attacking Austria-Hungary, which led to the Germans getting involved because they were allies with Austria-Hungary, and they headed for France because they were already kind of keeping this wary eye on France because France was their enemy. And so they decided in this whole process they're going to go ahead and head for France. I think France was an ally of Russia, and Russia was involved, so France got involved. So Germany decides to go ahead and head for France right away to take them out before they get too strong. In the process of going to France, they cross Belgium, right? Belgium, which didn't really have a whole lot to do with anything. they crossed Belgium. So if you take an army across another nation, technically that's an invasion, right? So they crossed Belgium, which was an invasion, which means the British got involved because the Brits and the Belgians, whatever you call them, Britain and Belgium were allies, okay? So all of a sudden you have all these nations fighting each other. And they headed down toward France, and that's when they started building trenches. The French came out to meet them, they fought, they built trenches, and then they dug in, and that's where the term dug in comes from, right? They dug in and they fought for months and months and months, and it was bloody, it was horrible, there was disease, it was just a brutal mess. It was a mess. U.S. What part does the U.S. have to play in all of this? The Americans did not want to get involved in the war, so the U.S. remained neutral as long as they could. President Woodrow Wilson he was determined to keep the U.S. out of this. He did not want to get involved. But the Germans made it almost impossible. They kept sinking merchant ships that weren't even military ships. And the reason they were doing that is because some of these merchant ships were actually smuggling ammunition and things like that. So they were sinking everything, and they started sinking American ships, and it made the Americans angry. Woodrow Wilson kept trying to, appease them. He also kept calling them out and telling them that they needed to follow the, what are they called? Some kind of like international rules or whatever they're called. Anyway, they were breaking the rules. They were doing things they shouldn't do. They kept sinking American ships. And finally, the last straw was when the British actually intercepted a message from one of the from a German that was supposed to go to Mexico. And in the message, it was asking the Mexicans to join the Germans in the war, and telling them that if they did that, Germany would help Mexico regain territory that they had lost from the United States, like way back in the Mexican-American War, or whatever. So anyway, they intercepted the message, the British intercepted it, and they took it to the Americans, and they're like, hey, look at this, because the British wanted the Americans to join the war and help them, of course. And the Americans saw that, they got really mad, and they decided at that point it's time to go ahead and jump in. So that's what they did. They entered the war in 1917. And they played a huge part in turning the tide. The other nations were getting weary. The fighting was just kind of like the fighting was just going on and on and on. The Germans were actually starting to make some progress, and if America wouldn't have joined, they may have actually won the war. But yeah, there was so much bloodshed and violence, and it was just dragging on, and the other countries were getting tired of fighting. America jumps in. They have fresh blood. They're fired up. They're angry at the Germans, and they boosted morale, and they really helped win. However, they did lose about 115,000 men. A lot of these men actually died from disease, not necessarily from bullets and fighting, because in World War I, that was a big thing, was in trench warfare. Disease killed a lot of people. So one of the interesting things, however, about about America's involvement in the war is that the American economy actually grew during World War I. So America, you know, other than losing men and losing soldiers, America was probably one of the countries that was least affected by the war. I mean, they were affected a lot, but not probably as much as a lot of other nations. And yeah, their economy grew, and so they're poising to become a world power. I mean, they already are a world power, but as we continue to follow this trajectory, we'll see what happens. America is growing stronger. You see here, all these other nations are fighting each other. Guess who jumps in and actually saves the day? The United States, right? So America is is positioning themselves to become one of the most powerful nations on the earth. They weren't really up to that point. They were getting stronger, but they weren't really the world power. But you see how this is happening. They jump in, they save the day, and in the process, their economy actually gets better. So anyway, the war ends. Armistice. November 11, 1918, so we just celebrated the 100-year anniversary of this about a year and a half ago. Germany was forced to agree to very harsh terms. Okay. So yeah, the British, Italians, see who else was involved, French, they were all very bitter and angry about this whole thing. They were very upset that the Germans, well, they blamed the Germans for starting the war. It wasn't entirely the Germans' fault, but they got the blame. And so they were very angry and bitter about the whole thing. And so when they signed a peace treaty, an armistice, they forced the Germans to agree to some really harsh terms. So one of the things they had to do was they had to give I'm not sure if I'm saying this right, but the Alsace-Lorraine region back to the French. So the Germans had taken this region from the French, I don't know, 20 or 30 years before that in a war. It was a very fertile area, and the French were still angry that the Germans had taken it from them. So they made them give that back. They stripped Germany of all of its colonies, all of its colonial outposts, forced them to reduce their army and navy, and completely eliminate their air force. By the way, this is the first time that air forces get used in war, right? For the first time airplanes get used in war is in World War I. Some say that Orville Wright, I think it was Orville, actually, he died fairly young. And some people think that he died because he was so saddened by what was happening with his invention of the airplane, how it was being used for death and destruction. Anyway, side note. So anyway, Germany was forced to completely eliminate their air force, and they were forced to pay $33 billion in reparations. And probably the biggest insult was that they were forced to take complete responsibility for the war. They forced them to say, this war was completely our fault, when that really was probably not the case. Woodrow Wilson did not like these terms. He tried to come up with a treaty that was wasn't nearly as harsh. And the British, well, especially the French, maybe the Italians, they wouldn't have it. They wanted to be harsh, right? He warned about another war coming if we don't handle this one correctly. And sure enough, he was right. So anyway, these harsh terms led to bitterness and resentment in Germany and other nations. There was a young soldier in Germany who fought in World War I. He was wounded, and he was languishing in a hospital, recovering from his wound when he got the news of Germany's surrender. He was extremely bitter about all of this, and he became determined to do something about it. His name, Adolf Hitler. All right, that's it for today's lesson. Read chapter 25 in Changing Frontiers. Make sure you leave your comments. And again, we are having a test next Thursday. Adios.